Welcome to the Worldwide Robotic Milking Podcast with Gareth Jones of Robotic Milking Systems and John Gerbitz of Cow Corner Consulting. This is the international podcast dedicated exclusively to robotic milking topics from planning through production.
Hey, my name's Gareth Jones from Robotic Milking Systems in the UK.
And I'm John Gerbitz with Cow Corner Robotic Milking Consulting in the US.
And together we are bringing you our podcast, Worldwide Robotic Milking. So last week, John, we looked at really our personal stories and the markets we're working in. And we thought today we would just outline what we're really going to look at in the up and coming episodes. And we really want to look at the different management systems that are in place worldwide for managing cows on robotics. And we've really identified the following areas. And the first one is voluntary milking, which has been around for maybe the last 25 to 30 years, which are broken down into house-free access, which is very popular, housed with guided systems or routed systems, and grazing as well with guided systems. So those are the three fundamental systems for voluntary milking. And then latterly in the market, we've seen more and more batch milking coming in. So I'm just wondering for you, John, how you see your market in the US, because I know it's very different to what we experience here in the UK.
The history, I'm sure, is shorter. The first robotic milking installation in the US was in July of 2000 here in Wisconsin. So it is a shorter history. Easy part of that answer is the batch milking. Right now we've had some interest in the US and maybe a little more interest in Canada, but right now I'm aware of only one batch milking installation in the US, and that's in Texas, and that's been running for, probably 4 years now. Then the free flow is probably about 80% of the US market, and guided flow would be about 20%. And we have some grazing installations, but it would be a very minor part of the market.
Okay. So for us, the area I'm going to talk about is the UK, but also the Republic of Ireland. So United Kingdom, just for those people in the US who don't know how it's made up, is Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland. So it's those four markets make up the United Kingdom, and then Ireland in its own right. And I would say within the UK, free access most really makes up about 80% of what goes on here. So historically, there's been a lot of free access. There is guided, and I'm going to say that's around about 10%. So we're not too different. You've got more guided going on over there by the sounds of things. Grazing is geographic. It depends where obviously we can produce grass. And so grazing tends to happen in the western part of the UK. And I would put that figure at around about 10%, something like that. If you look at Ireland, it's the complete opposite. So in Ireland, we're running at, I think, around about 80% grazing, which is very, very different, I would say, to the rest of the world. Housed, guided, I would say would be 10%, and housed free access 10%. And as far as batch milking goes in Ireland, it would be non-existent. Batch milking in the UK is talked about, but as yet, there's no systems up and running. So I think between us, we've got quite an interesting combination there.
Maybe we need to back up a little bit and talk about definitions of free access and guided flow, because I do hear different definitions, and I think most of our listeners probably have an idea of what we're talking about, but to make sure that we've got the same terms. So in the UK, what's the difference between free access and guided flow?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, just to be clear on this. So free access in the UK is no gates in the building at all. The cow can eat, lie down, get milked in any particular order. It's totally open shed. So the nice thing about free access is cows decide what they do when they do it. The downside, if it is a downside, is you have to fetch some animals every day, but it depends how hard you're running the machines then in terms of how many cows you have to fetch. So that would be, we would talk here maybe about 5% of cows need fetching. I don't know what figures you use on a free access system.
I think we'd be in a similar range on a free access system, fetching 5 to 10%, and agree with you completely that it depends a little bit on how full the barn is and how busy the robots are. As free time goes down, the amount of fetching is going to go up. And then
Exactly.
by contrast, in a guided flow barn, we're looking at a pre-selection gate that determines whether or not cows have access to the robots. If they don't have milk access, the pre-selection gate will send them to feed. If they do have access, it allows them to go to the robot. And then cows can make a loop as many times as they want to, but they have to go in that direction through the pre-selection gate to feed through a one-way gate back to stalls. And we also have different variations of that. The modified guided barns, in my mind, a modified guided barn is a barn where cows have access to both stalls and feed in the same area without going through a gate. And in that case, in order to get them to go back through the one-way gate, we're putting water only on, they have to go away from the bunk to get to water. Again, they can make that loop as many times as they want to, but that would be what I would call a modified guided system. And then we've got some other in-between things where they put selection gates together with free access, and I don't really know what those are. I would not call them modified guided, although some people do call that a modified guided situation. We've also got some where there's a finger gate that allows cows into a commitment pen and a sort gate that lets them out of the commitment pen. Again, I'm not really sure whether I would call that modified guided. I think I would not call it modified guided, but it's really not free flow either.
Okay,
Do you see
so
what does guided flow look like in the UK?
guided flow in the UK is exactly how as you just summarized it, but instead of when you've got a cubicle backing onto a feed fence whereby you cannot 100% guide, that will be called semi-guided.
Okay.
So as opposed to the term you used was
Modified guided.
Modified guided, yeah, okay. And in my experience, and we're going to get on to this a lot more detail, that if you're retrofitting, that the guided can be a lot harder to implement because it depends where your cubicles are, and to get the one-way system running is more challenging. So yeah, so it sounds like we're both on a similar page there.
It does take some creativity to adapt a guided flow barn to a retrofit. The other thing I wanted to throw in here as we talk about the modified guided or the semi-guided, in my mind, they manage very much like a fully guided barn if we're talking about the modified it or semi-guided as we've described it. If it's not as we've described it, then the management can be much more like a free flow barn.
Okay. Yeah, and then, so as I said initially, these are all voluntary systems. These two type of layouts are voluntary, where the cow, although one's on a one-way system and one's on free access, but they both go into both these systems, they both go into the robot on their own volition, as opposed to batch milking where we're actually herding cows around. So, and then the other one, John, which I've got quite a lot of experience with, is grazing. And I call that on a guided system because we do use a separation gate to marshal cows in and out. So you're saying in the US there's not a lot of this going on?
There's not a lot. I have been on some farms. Typically during the peak of the grazing season, they will use an AB system where cows go out to pasture and then have to come back through the milking facility in order to get to the next pasture. I think later in the season, those tend to transition to where cows come and go more freely when there's less grass and more feeding in the barn, then they'll move away from the AB system to maybe just a A system.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's the same over here. AB, where you got 2 paddocks grazing on both. ABC, you see a lot in Ireland, because in Ireland they go for low yields, because they're really looking for, they use crossbred cows in a lot of these farms. Fairly low yielding cows, 5 to 6,000 litres. But they look at their milk solids. They're interested in fat and protein, because in Ireland a lot of the milk there is processed, because they have 70, believe it or not, in the UK we've got 7,000 dairy herds. In Ireland they have 17,000, but the herds are smaller, and because they can produce a lot of milk, if you look at the population, the UK 70 million people and Ireland is just over 5 million people. So they don't have the mouths to drink the milk, so it has to be processed. So these factories actually shut for 6 weeks of the year. So you can't produce milk from December and maybe until the end of January. So all the herds have to block calve. So they start calving in Feb, cows go out to grass, and they will then milk off grass until November. So it's a very, very different market. So in fairness to the Irish, they have developed a system of grazing that they really were the pioneers grazing with robots, and they've made it work. And they actually did develop the original grazing gate over there. So that's how it's all come about. So the robots over there, yeah, are out of use for sort of 6 weeks in a lactation.
So what's the difference then between the AB system and the ABC system?
So ABC is 3 8-hour grazing blocks to keep cows moving. So in that way, you hope to achieve up to 3 milkings a day out at grass, as opposed to AB, which is just 2 12-hour blocks. The further you get away, I tend to find if you get over 500 meters away from the robots, then your visits will drop off. But they certainly do a very good job over there. It's all about grassland management, out with a plate meter, because you have to strip graze as well to allocate just enough grass for that 8-hour period or 12-hour period, in order, because what brings cows back to the robot is it's the next break of grass, not the concentrates in the machine. So, and you're trying to get some rhythm going with the cows. So that's quite, ABC I find is quite challenging, but it happens a lot in Ireland. In the UK, where you got high yielding cows, quite often go ABC, but then C will be 8 hours inside on you would call it bunk, we'd call it on the feed fence. The system we've seen coming in more recently is batch milking, which we both have a bit of experience with. So how are you finding that in the US?
I have not been on a batch milking farm in the US. I had an opportunity to visit with a company rep a couple of weeks ago who has toured several different farms on some batch milking installations. One of the things that's interesting with the batch milking is they are not necessarily feeding in the robots, that the cows learn their way through, so that they're brought to a commitment pen. And maybe a little bit more description of exactly what batch milking is. You mentioned bringing cows to the robot, but we'll have the installations in the US that I'm familiar with might be anywhere from 16 to 20 or maybe 10 to 20 robots in an area, and there's a commitment pen that feeds into all of these robots. So cows are brought from the pen to the robots, and then rather than finding their way through a parlor, they find their way through robots. And so there's some labor savings there, but it allows them to still manage the cows as they would with a rotary. So some of the things that we deal with in voluntary milking about getting cows to come to the robot and dealing with managing the pen while the cows are in the pen, we don't have to worry about those in batch milking, but we still get the labor savings to go along with it. And so some of these are working with feed in the robots, some without. The other thing, one of the things that we see in the US on our parlor installations that becomes a headache is getting cows in the wrong pen. As they exit the parlor, somebody forgot a gate and we've got a bunch of cows in the wrong pen. And in the batch milking systems, that's all taken care of with gates on the backside of the robots that are making sure that even if the commitment pen wasn't empty or the holding area wasn't empty when they brought the next group up, they're automatically going to find their way back to the pens where they belong. And so what really struck me in the conversation I had a couple of weeks ago was the extremely low labor involved. And it's really somebody can bring the cows to the commitment pen, go back and scrape the alleys and groom the stalls, and then be back to push any stragglers through, and extremely labor efficient on the batch milking.
Yeah, I think that's something I would agree with. I think the principle is, and again, we'll get into more detail on this in future episodes, but it's it's being able to just bring groups of cows, and you just have to think of it as, it's conventional milking, but with a bank of robots. And then
you had mentioned in our last episode the capital investment. This is something has always puzzled me about batch milking is how do you make the investment in the robots and not have the what I consider management advantages of voluntary milking. But you mentioned a project you had worked on where the investment was actually less with batch milking than it was with voluntary milking.
it wasn't that particular situation because he had to build new housing for voluntary without getting into too much detail. But the work that I've done is with batch milking, you can't afford to have any more robots working than you would for a voluntary milking situation. So, and when I say that, if we think about a 24-hour day with batch milking, really to get the return on the investment, you need to be milking for 7 hours, 3 times a day, with an hour between for washing down. So there's our 24 hours. So if we take an example where we're going to do this, and we got 3 hours when we're not milking, that really is equivalent to a voluntary milking system where we got 10% free time or 2.5 hours when there's no milking going on. And the people who don't sort of get batch milking or don't understand the economics behind it think, well, we want to milk our cows 3 times a day, we want to do it in 3 hours, and then it doesn't stack up. So you have to be prepared to milk 24 hours a day with an hour off just for cleaning down, and away you go again. So unlike voluntary milking, you are committing manpower 24 hours a day, but with a rotary milking parlour with 1,000 cows, you must already into that territory anyway. So like you said, rather than having to have maybe 4 men involved for the rotary when you want to milk, with batch milking you might be down to 2 men. So that for me is where batch milking fits in, with big numbers of cows with 24-hour labor.
I don't think we quite finished the discussion of, in the housed situation, the choice between guided flow and free flow, and what are some of the things that go into that decision. We did mention that if it's a retrofit, it's going to be easier to retrofit free flow than it is to retrofit guided flow. What are some of the other things that you're talking to your customers about when they're making that choice between guided flow and free flow?
For me, this comes down to 2 things really, and I think it tends to be on the bigger units. So for me, the advantages of guided is potentially less labor, because on the farms I go to, they seem to be fetching very, very few cows. So for me, the number one, if you're going to go guided, is little or no fetching, and on a big unit that's going to amount to quite a lot of labor on a free access system. I'm not seeing a lot of extra milk coming out of those robots with pre-selection, so I don't see that as an advantage. So really for me, labor is a big one, and then as you've talked about, there is a possibility to feed less concentrates in the machine if that's the route they want to go down. So for me, those are the 2 main benefits, which would sort of lend itself maybe to the slightly bigger units okay, we're still under 500 cows here, most probably, but maybe 4 robots and some employed manpower.
Sure. I think I would add to that, for me, and this is going to kind of lead into our next episode where we're going to talk more about the role of forages in free flow. But the first question I ask when somebody is deciding between guided flow and free flow is what do your forages look like? And that the forages are affecting how cows come to the robot in either situation. I prefer to have less energy at the bunk in a free flow barn. And in the Midwest, with some of the forages that we're producing, it becomes difficult when you've got a ration that is 80% extremely high, or forages that are 80% extremely high quality corn silage. It gets difficult to take enough starch out of that. You almost end up putting straw in. And so if the goal is to provide the most possible nutrients from the forages, then I think we got to take a hard look at guided flow. If forage quality is a challenge anyway because of growing conditions in a certain area, then I think we may take a closer look at free flow because we're going to be supplementing concentrates anyway. And along with that opportunity to get down to no feed in the guided flow systems if we choose that direction. It's interesting when we think about that, it kind of fits in also with the grazing that you've talked about and the extremely high quality forages there, similar to how we manage the high quality forages in our housed guided flow systems.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you're using the forage to move the cow, not the concentrates in the machine. Yeah. So, and the other interesting thing is, and I think that's what's really going to be the subject of our next podcast, is I'm pretty sure in the US you can produce better quality forage than we can, and most probably so in the UK, in certain areas of the UK, all you can produce is grass silage. It rains too much, so that's what you're stuck with. In the drier areas, you can grow maize, maybe 50-50 maize, grass silage. So I think for our next episode, it's going to be quite interesting to get into the nitty gritty of that, to talk about forage and compare our markets.
And I think that's a good place to wrap this up, leading into that next episode on forages. I think we've covered pretty well the differences between free flow, guided flow, batch milking, and housed versus pasture.
Thank you for listening to the Worldwide Robotic Milking Podcast, where Gareth Jones of Robotic Milking Systems and John Gerbitz of Cow Corner Consulting share their insights on robotic milking around the world. Join us again for the next episode, and be sure to like the show where you listen to podcasts.